to get started.
Okay.
Next speaker is going to welcome these
So I want to thank you guys for the invitation to this wonderful and well-motivated celebration. I want to talk about the methods and epistemology of science, and I want to talk about two questions that Stathis has views about. One of them is the question whether best confirmed theories are probably correspondence-wise approximately true. Some people say yes, and he's one of them. And then there are people who are fans of the pessimistic meta-induction, people like Loudon and Stanford and Rausch, and also some comments of Rosenberg, although he's usually on the other side, suggesting that the idea that best confirmed theories are correspondence-wise approximately true is a mistake. And then there's a second question I want to look at, namely, does scientific realism require causal realism? And lots of people say no, and Stathis has sometimes said no, and he has lots of company. And there's some of us only realist about causation, so I want to say yes. But my answer to the first question is yes, sort of, pretty often. That is to say, I want to suggest that the worry that people like Loudon have raised about unconceived alternatives actually requires some adjustment in our understanding, but it's in the direction of a broader notion of correspondence rather than a narrower one, and then I want to defend the yes view on causation. So I want to talk about the dialectical situation with respect to whether scientists have knowledge of truth. There's an initial verificationist criticism that says we can't know about unobservables, and realists put forward abductive arguments for and verificationists like Arthur Fine and Bas van Frossen showed us that these arguments in a certain sense beg the question or fail to appreciate the subtleties. The topic of my talk starts here. I want to look at the effects of the pessimistic meta-induction. So someone might think the realist abductive argument fails by its own standards because so often earlier scientific theories that were well established were false by realist standards, as you can see, because if you're a realist and you believe the current theory, then you got to believe those theories were false. And most realists who've responded have been generous about what they thought approximation was like and what they thought reference was like, so it will turn out on their view that many of these theories were approximately true, and their terms really did refer to things very different from the things that the authors of the theories thought they were talking about. And then I also want to talk about thin truth. If you look at many person stages of Hilary Putnam, at all the person stages of Random, and some interpretations of Arthur Fine, you can discover that we do know scientific truths. We even know scientific truths about electrons, but they aren't truths. That if you move to a conception of truth that's thin enough, then you could avoid realism while not denying that we know about truth. And then I want to talk a little bit about causation. So, but I couldn't do that immediately. Okay. So here's the pessimistic meta-induction, and this is from Kyle Stanford's Pyrrhic Victories of Scientific Realism. The grossly historical procession shows that past theories have been quite successful in the past in ways that impress contemporary realists, even though they're inconsistent with current theory. And it says empirical success cannot possibly be a reliable indicator of truth about nature, no matter what the truth is. Any general practice of inferring from such successes to the approximate truth or reference of theories would routinely, if not invariably, lead us astray. So that's associated with other worries about realism. Rosenberg, who's typically on the other side of here, but makes the point in this wonderful paper on the field guide to species of naturalism, the hypothesis might be the most well-confirmed among alternatives, but it might be far from well-confirmed and still less approximately true. So if the range of alternatives you've been able to dream up happens not to include anything near the truth, you could pick the one that works best and you could be bounded away from the truth. And similarly, it's possible that the historical evidence is insufficient to rule out the problem of unconceived alternatives. This is Stanford again. He says, when we theorize about such matters as the constitution of matter itself, the remote history of the earth and its inhabitants, the most minute working of our bodies, and the structure of the farthest reaches of the universe, we may not have thought of all. The alternative we consider may not have included something close to the truth. And there are these worrisome cases about the ether and caloric fluid and Weissmann's differentiated chromatin, and just on. Okay, so I'm going to ask whether this raises troubles for scientific realism, and if realists infer from the empirical success of a theory to its approximate truth, and if you reject the kind of generous referential hypotheses that many realists want to have, where a term in a theory can count as referring to something that people were getting at, even if the proposed referent is not, doesn't have the properties they thought it did. So if you reject those hypotheses, and if realists claim that scientists rarely suffer from the following of unconceived alternatives, and if realists claim that scientists regularly get fundamental theories exactly right, and if theories like Weissmann's exhibit the empirical success that realists strive to explain, then realism is in trouble. But I want to say that there are too many ifs in here. I think realism is actually in pretty good shape, but I'm going to claim that even so, the insights of the pessimistic meta-induction does indicate that we need to revise semantics for the interpretation of scientific theory. So I want to claim that there's actually a point here, but the revision will be more correspondence-y rather than less. So first point I want to make about, can I walk over? No, I can't. I can't talk without pacing. A funny thing happened on the way to anti-realism. The arguments for realism have been reconfigured over time. So Putnam, who sort of launched all this, describing the position of mind, said that realism is the only philosophy that doesn't make the success of science a miracle. And he formulated the view as the view that terms in mature sciences generally refer, and the theories are generally approximately true. By the time Stanford looked at it, it turns out that in Hillary Putnam's memorable phrase, the success of science would be a miracle if our scientific theories were not true, more formally, that the approximate truth of our current scientific theories provides the best and perhaps the only explanation for the empirical successes those theories enjoy. Now that's a local argument. It's an argument from the success of particular theories to the approximate truth of the theories. Now, the argument of mind that Putnam was summarizing here, didn't say that. I argued that in cases where scientists are routinely empirically successful, the deep explanation for their capacity to do that is that the background theories they believe contain information about the world, including information about little things. So I gave a kind of transcendental argument for realism. So it's important to see that a lot of recent discussions about realism focus on an argument that I don't think Putnam intended to give, that I haven't. But the local non-miracles argument, the one that I didn't give and maybe Putnam didn't either, actually works pretty well sometimes. In its fully general version, it fails spectacularly. If you go from a theory being empirically successful to its probably being approximately true, you're in real trouble. Given any empirically reliable theory, you can recursively generate an indefinite number of hideously false theories that make the same prediction. But if you look at a practice-specific version, suppose you say that a theory that's actually proposed and accepted and is empirically successful, then it's probably approximately true. That actually works pretty well. That is to say, I don't recommend this inference, but if you were to make this inference, you wouldn't be in nearly as much trouble, because if you're generous about when reference obtains, but not too generous about what you count as empirically successful, and if you don't demand that approximate truth get the fundamental metaphysics right, that it doesn't bother you that the term electron was introduced as a particle term, but you know particles are delocalized, so that the term doesn't refer. Unless you're doing that, actually the point that Kitcher makes in the advancement of science, that useful parts of successful theories are approximately true, works pretty well. Okay, I want to ask, why does it matter that we switch from the fully general version to the practice-specific version? Okay. Now I want to talk about this transcendental argument for realism, because that will allow me to explain why switching from the local to the, the fully general version to the practice-specific version works. So in actual practice, we have a finite body of data. There are indefinitely many pairwise incompatible candidates for empirical success that are compatible with the data we have. We choose the best from a small handful of guesses, and we end up often with empirically successful theories. How do we do this? Why? What makes our guessing reliable with respect to empirical success? The realist answer is this. I'm going to revise it and update it, but here it is. We rely on background theories and methods. Those background theories have some virtues which explain how they contribute to our reliably guessing the answer to the next scientific question. One of those virtues is approximate truth, leading often enough to a small handful containing an approximately true and successful, predictably successful answer to a new scientific question. Okay, so that's the point here is that talk about unconceived alternatives cuts both ways. If I have a finite body of data and I'm going to make an empirical generalization, there are infinitely many generalizations that I could make, and many of them are going to remain unconceived. How is it that we're lucky enough that we often conceive of generalizations that are successful? Answer, we already know a lot of stuff. Okay, so that's the argument for realism. I want to talk about taking the view that Putnam put forward, namely that terms of mature theory typically refer, and that the laws of the theory belonging to a mature science are typically approximately true, and amending that conception to get a richer and richer conception of how scientific concepts of language meet the world. Well, there's an obvious amendment. You could talk about reference failure and partial denotation and denotational refinement. You could say, well, terms often are connected to the world, but sometimes they're connected ambiguously, and we refine our language so as to eliminate the ambiguity. That's Hartree Field on denotational refinement. Sometimes some terms just don't refer, and we drop them. Okay. A better thing to do is to think of reference as a dialectical process of accommodation of language to the world, where as we continue to do science, if we're being successful, we revise our language not merely by deleting terms that didn't refer and resolving partial denotation, but by introducing new terminology and seeing how it works and refining it. So you might think of reference as an ongoing process of trying to fiddle with our concepts and language to align with the world more carefully. That's a better way of doing it. And now I want to talk about the idea that reference is a matter of accommodation of language to causal structure. So I want to give an example of semantics of something simple in human language. Paul Sherman and his associates have identified two alarm calls in Belding's ground squirrels. One of these alarm calls is an alarm call for aerial predators and another for terrestrial predators. Why did we get this semantics? Is it the case that there's always an aerial predator present when there's an A call, and always a terrestrial predator present when there's a T call? No, there are false positives, false negatives, all sorts of stuff goes on. But what's really true is that the A call occurs frequently with respect to aerial predators rather than terrestrial ones. The T call occurs frequently with respect to terrestrial predators, not aerial ones. There are different evasive responses when the animals hear the calls, and that helps to explain how Belding's ground squirrels avoid predation. So a referential hypothesis here explains a certain success avoiding predation by talking about a kind of imperfect alignment between calls and features of the world. So it explains how there's an accommodation or fit between signals and behavior that explains successes. And I want to suggest that referential hypotheses for human language are like that. So in a simple case, you could think that a bunch of terms T in a discipline refer to corresponding families of properties. I'm thinking here of natural terms, just in case that each of the terms is pretty often applied to things with those properties. And the fact that that's so explains the inductive or explanatory success of people in a discipline. We're looking at referential hypotheses as explanations for inductive or theoretical success. And then to make this dialectical, you add reference failure, partial denotation, and a lot of other stuff. So, I don't know how to do this fast enough, but what's all this for? Why do we need to have a language such that its usage is aligned with causal structures in the world? You can't answer that question without doing some baby philosophy of science. So here's some. To a good first approximation, at a given time in a research community, a theory counts as highly confirmed by a body of evidence, just in case the theory is projectable by the standards then current in the discipline, that the evidence favors the theory over the relevant alternatives, those are the other projectable theories, and such that the evidence was gathered so as to control for artifacts suggested by projectable theories. That's just how we evaluate evidence. We count judgments as projectability as evidential. The fact that a theory is highly projectable means that it's one of the serious candidates for the truth. Right? There will be others. The fact that a theory is wildly unprojectable means you ignore it. Every physics department, every astronomy department, every philosophy department gets every few years a manuscript in which people count the number of references to cattle in the Quran and divide by their grandmother's age at death and add a bunch of other stuff and get pi and discover the nature of the universe, and we don't send those out for refereeing. What we're doing with projectability judgments is we're narrowing the choice space. We have a scientific question, we want to know which answers are possible. We narrow the choice space by using the conceptual resources that we have. Okay. When does this work? When is this going to contribute to either empirical or theoretical success? So the rule is choose from theories that are recommended by the best current theories, controlling for effects suggested by the best current theories. What does this rule presuppose? It presupposes that often enough, when you ask a scientific question, a projectable answer, what did I do? Often enough, among the projectable answers actually proposed and invented will be something close enough to the truth. What makes that possible is not that the current theories are current, but that they're approximately true, and that the concepts and terminology that play a role in those theories are apt for the invention of projectable theories, some of which turn out to be close to the truth. So our process of testing theories by choosing among the projectable ones presupposes that we have a conceptual apparatus apt for generating pretty good guesses often enough. And the theory of reference is a theory that's supposed to explain how that's possible. We already have our language accommodated to the structure of the world well enough that this guides reliable guessing. So I'll skip ahead. Okay. So, what contribution to the reliability of methods do reference and accommodation help to explain? You guessed it, guessing. A theory of reference according to which we've accommodated our language in the past to features of the world, and we're making use of that accommodation to make future guesses, addresses the problem of unconceived alternatives. The abductive case for realism says that the reliability of methods depends on virtues of the preceding science, including approximate truths involving terms that refer or partially denote real phenomena whose properties can be understood by further theoretical developments involving denotational refinement and so forth. Okay, so the realist semantics, which says that we should think of our scientific language as having already been in the past pretty well accommodated in the world, is exactly designed to explain why we can get away with choosing from the plausible alternatives in the future. Because if we've been successful enough, both the theories and the vocabulary we have are apt for generating good new conjectures. Okay, so I'll do this fast. Okay. I want to indicate that we really use this conception of accommodation in important ways. First off, when people invent scientific theories and when they write grant proposals, there's a notion, my son's a chemist, so what's called a literature precedent. If I write a grant proposal to do synthetic chemistry in a certain way, I'm going to cite precedents in the literature for thinking that the reactions I propose will work. those precedents won't have been the demonstration that those reactions work. They will be theoretical reasons for thinking that they will, and the capacity to engage in that kind of practice depends on chemists having already developed a vocabulary which is pretty well aligned with the microstructure of matter. The other thing is that we can scrutinize generalizations that are under-theorized. We can say, following Amundsen, that we should be cautious realists. We should believe that there's always a reality underlying a phenomenal law, even if we don't know what it is. And that's really an important idea. Repeatable regularities are causally underwritten somehow. That claim is not a priori. It's not a regulative ideal. It's not an ideal. It's a well-confirmed generalization about how we come up with repeatable regularities. But it's regulative because if I propose a phenomenological regularity, a legitimate criticism, not necessarily a fatal criticism of it, will be, I don't see how that could be causally underwritten by stuff we know about. Okay, so that what we're doing is making use of accumulated causal knowledge as a source of critique. Okay. Now I want to talk about how to hair up the theory of reference. Okay. I think there are cases where we should think of language as corresponding to reality in science, where the picture that terms either refer or don't refer or partially denote isn't rich enough to do what we want. Consider the term species. It might be that the term species corresponds to a unique family of sets of populations. I don't think there's any chance that's true, but I mean, it might be so. You might be a pluralist, think of Kitcher, but there are some people, Arashevsky and Mishler are examples, who think that there just aren't species, that there's no species level. Now, what do they think? Is what they think incompatible with realism? Well, it's not. What they think is approximately this. There are many evolutionarily stable, explanatorily important islands in morphospace. The use of the term species usually reflects back about small islands, but we need a new conceptual terminology because, as it happens, there isn't a smallest size. Well, someone who says the use of the term species corresponds to islands in morphospace, but in a hideously messy way, and we need to have a deeper correspondence, that person isn't abandoning realism. That person is calling for a better fit between language and the world. So what we would like to do is to expand the notion of reference. I'm proposing we do that. So we say, of course, the term species referred. What it means for a term to refer is for it to participate in this dialectical process of language improvement. And sometimes terms like species may turn out to be the case that they don't, in the end, we don't want to say they refer to anything, but they refer. And a similar thing might well be true in the case of gene. It might be that there are so many, by the time we look at how many genetic phenomena there are, it might be less convenient to say that the term gene partially denotes all these different kinds of information and coding sequences, and instead say we need a better vocabulary. I don't know whether that's true or not, but if someone said we need a closer fit to the world, that person wouldn't be abandoning realism about the word gene, and that person wouldn't have thought that the term gene wasn't crucial in our ability to frame scientific theories that led to progress about inheritance. Okay, and then I think that there are other cases where language can be accommodated to the world, but where talk about reference isn't exactly what you ought to do. I think there are cases where a term does not refer to a natural kind, but given the inferential architecture of the discipline, the use of the term still contributes to the accommodation of the conceptual framework of working scientists to the world. And the key example out here is oxidation state in chemistry. So a nucleus in an atom has an oxidation state. There are formal rules for assigning oxidation state. Oxidation state has something to do with electron density in the neighborhood of the nucleus. But the convention for assigning oxidation state is really a convention. Very probably, if you have two nuclei, even of the same element, in two very different molecules, and they both have oxidation state +4, there's not very much you can assume they have in common. On the other hand, chemistry students are taught that this is so. And the sort of inferential architecture they pick up appeals to oxidation states in characterizing particular narrow classes of reactions. So because the inferential architecture that's part of the discipline is sensitive to how artificial the term oxidation state is, the use of that term actually, in practice, aligns their thinking with causal reality in chemistry, even though the term doesn't strictly refer. There are other cases, I think, where a term refers, but where the inferential architecture of the discipline makes the use of the term undermine the accommodation of language to causal structure. My favorite one is the term evolved. In evolutionary psychology, the inferential patterns characteristic of contemporary evolutionary psychology treat the term evolved almost interchangeably with the term innate. Okay. Well, some things have evolved, and there is such a thing as being innate. There are probably several different things that amount to being innate. As it happens, this term is correctly applied to some traits, but the inferential architecture gets it wrong about the connection between a behavioral trait being evolved and being learned. So I think that there are ways in which, when we talk about either a successful accommodation of language and concepts to the world or a failure of accommodation, the notion of reference by itself is not sufficient. Reference and partial implication are not sufficient. We need a slightly more complicated formulation. Another possible worry about truth is that we should have a thin theory of truth. This is something that both Putnam and Arthur Fine, perhaps, and Bob Random put forward. So maybe we need a conception of scientific theories as approximately true, but maybe truth really isn't a real property. Random says this, and why truth is not important in philosophy. Regarding the maxim to seek the truth, he says, so long as we pay sufficiently close attention to the reasons that can be brought for and against various claims, their truth will take care of itself, or at least we will have done everything we can do about it. There is no metaphysically weighty property of being true. Truth is not a concept that has an important explanatory role to play in philosophy. It is completely unsuited to do any of the explanatory work for which philosophers have typically enlisted its aid. So you might have followed everything I said so far and said, oh yeah, lots of theories are approximately true and that's how we can go further, but truth isn't a real property. That won't work. I won't do as much of this as I thought I would because I want to finish. But one of the funny things about truth not being explanatory is that accuracy of maps is surely explanatory. Everybody agrees that in the Allied landings in Normandy, the fact that the maps did not show hedgerows made it the case that the Allied planning didn't include earth-moving equipment. So that's a case where the relative accuracy of various maps surely plays a causal role in explaining an observable outcome. And since the content of a map, a digitally represented map, can be intertranslated with sentences about the distribution of matter, it looks as though we're in trouble if the accuracy of maps is causally explanatory. It's very unlikely that truth is never causally explanatory. And anyway, why would paying sufficiently close attention to reasons that can be brought forward against things provide even stable answers? Well, it could be that internal commitments of the relevant normative community will always yield convergence on answers. We know that's not true. But it could be that if you add the properties of the actual subject matter, then communities might tend to converge. But of course, that's already to talk about reference. And anyway, most epistemically admirable communities revise their norms by considering whether they truth track. So it looks as though these things aren't available. And notice, in the case of the word true, there's the T schema. Quote, S is true if and only if S. So you might be able to think you could erase the notion of truth, and of course Brandom has a very sophisticated pro-sentential analysis. There aren't those analyses for approximate truth, partial denotation, accommodation. There's no way of waving your hand and making these semantic relations go away. Okay. I want to suggest that there are several reasons why we should think of accommodation of concepts and computational machinery to the world as the primitive semantic notion and truth and approximate truth has special cases. In the human case, I think in many scientific cases, approximate truth and determinate reference are scientific achievements that may take decades to achieve. So suppose it turns out that the term species doesn't refer, but that later we will have an enriched vocabulary. Well, it's going to have been the case that for a very long time people were encoding important information about biology using a term that wasn't strictly speaking referential, and then we will someday clean it up. Now maybe that's not going to be necessary for species, but it's certainly going to be necessary for some terms. But the other thing is, we want to be able to have a theory of signaling for our animal and botanical and fungal and eubacterial and archibacterial friends, and almost all biological systems where organisms are near each other involve signaling, and it can't be that that's always a matter of reference and predication. We need an account of how signaling between roots of plants, which engage in kin recognition, convey information, but we don't want to talk about, I don't want to talk about the propositional content or the compositional semantics. Okay, so think about quorum sensing in bacteria. Now, I've rushed because I wanted to make sure I got talking about causal realism. Okay, should scientific realists be realist about causation? There's a way of getting the answer sure. Sure, they believe in electrons. They believe that electrons have negative charge. Having negative charge is or is defined in terms of a family of causal powers. End of story. They believe in electrons. They believe in charge. Charge is a causal power. Okay, home free, causal powers. But of course, no good David Lewis style Humean will let it go at that. Here's a rebuttal. Of course, scientific realists should believe in some causal powers. The issue is not whether they should. It's not whether or not they should believe in causal powers. The issue is whether they should adopt a Humean counterfactual analysis of causation a la David Lewis or related authors. So the key idea here is that A cause B or A has causal powers P is supposed to be analyzed in terms of counterfactuals with truth conditions formulated in terms of possible worlds, where the proximity relation between possible worlds is in turn defined in terms of the laws that hold in those worlds, where laws in a possible world are those that meet some formal criterion of simplicity. So that's roughly the project. And I want to ask, when is such an analysis reductive or anti-realist with respect to causation? If there are versions that are anti-realist, then you might think we should adopt one and you could still believe in charge, but you wouldn't be a realist about causation. So, when is Lewis-style Humeanism anti-realist? Well, someone might think, when is it not? And you might think, I mean, I can believe both of these things, but I won't argue for them. I think the notion of an event or property instantiation, the things that fall under laws, are already causal notions. I think the notion of property is the causal notion. So following Shoemaker, I think you can't even talk about laws governing property instantiations without already talking in a causal vocabulary. I think always, well, I should say in practice, I think always when people make judgments of law-likeness or proximity, they're tacitly making use of causal concepts. So I think that the Humean analysis a la David Lewis or at variance collapses to a peculiar kind of causal realism, but not everybody agrees with that. So what I want to suggest is that the key anti-realist idea that would lie behind one of these Humean counterfactual analyses would be to replace notion of local causal phenomena, this thing hitting that, made that sound, with a global phenomenon. You might have thought that the causation was something that happened in the near vicinity of this object and the glass, but instead it was a matter of a law holding throughout space-time, and then some counterfactuals about worlds whose proximity to the actual world depends on how our laws compare with the laws in those possible worlds. So I want to say that a cosmopolitan reductive globalization, the thing you'd have to do if you wanted to move away from the idea of local causal phenomena, would require formality. There should be no tacitly causal language involved, and that would, I think, be fatal. But I'm going to pretend I don't think that. And there's got to be some kind of globalization. The truth conditions for causal claims involve all of space-time. They involve what laws there are in the actual world, which determines part of the proximity judgment with respect to other possible worlds. And I think they have to be fully cosmopolitan. That is to say, like laws, causal claims could be equally refuted by distant or local events. And from my causal claim here, would have something to do with what the laws are in the actual world and then some. Very distant events in space-time could be as much undermine a law as close ones, proximal ones. I think that if you have a version of Lewis-style Humeanism satisfying these constraints, you get a very peculiar result. You get it that if there are no causal notions, I don't think you can rationalize projectability judgments, but here's the decisive factor. Between 1 and 3 together, I think you can't detect local causal relations, properties, or powers. You were able to detect this causal relation, and that is not because you have a capacity to detect features in all of space-time. So I think, but I'm not going to argue for this, I think that if you adopt this kind of conception, you can't explain how we know about anything. So I claim you can't explain how we even get science off the ground. But someone might say, there exist ways to still explain causal knowledge. Perhaps there exists an a priori defensible version of inference to the best explanation. And maybe when we have that deployed, we can justify inferences from proximal, whatever kind of events they are, to conclusions about all of space-time. Or maybe there's an appropriately powerful, approximately a priori defensible version of methodological unification that will allow us to make this leap from local events to to property instantiations throughout space-time. Or perhaps some clever Bayesian approach will work. Perhaps. But human language capacities evolved from earlier signaling capacities. Early signaling capacities depended on the capacity of animals and plants to detect things. They didn't use these techniques. Okay. There's this really neat phenomenon of quorum sensing in bacteria, where bacterial populations that are infectious often will not begin attacking the tissue of the organism they're in until they reach a certain population density, which they signal by producing chemicals to which they respond. When the concentration gets high enough, they then begin digesting the material in the host. They're detecting that chemical signal, and they surely don't do it this way. So I want to suggest that you can't give an account of the detecting capacities that underwrite signaling for non-human animals if you have a Humean account of causation that's genuinely reductive. Now notice, I don't myself believe that the notion of law is a fundamental notion and the notion of causation is derivative. But I have not argued that that's not true. It could be that a certain 37-clause law variation on Lewis on Hume about laws and causation is exactly true. What I'm suggesting is that if you think of that as eliminative, that if you think of it as a causal anti-realist position, then you're in trouble in general, and you're especially in trouble if you want to talk about how our capacity to signal to each other is continuous with the capacity of our ancestors and the signaling capacity of other organisms. Thank you.
Exactly on time. Okay, right. So we have some time for questions, and I think I saw David's hand first.
Oh, then let's get it out of the way, because it's not a question about the positive signs, but about the semantics. I just have a question about the notion of accommodation. I'm curious about something. Is it just dependent on a particular conception of what reference consists in? Because I can see how accommodation would work in the case...
Can you yell at me here? I don't have a hearing aid that I have on order, so yell at me.
I'm talking pretty loud.
Yeah, you are. Yeah, okay. My fault, not yours.
Okay. Is the notion of accommodation tied to a particular conception of the relation of reference? I'm thinking in the following terms. I can see how it works when you're thinking of reference fundamentally as a conventional connection between sign and referent. But I'm just wondering how it works, for instance, if you have a conception according to which what gives meaning to expressions is something that has to do with concepts, information, descriptions,
yeah.
and then reference is something that happens.
Okay, well, the conventional is, I think, not the right word, but
Right.
okay. I think that if you look at issues in the history of science where someone wants to know, is an ancient Chinese report of a comet a report of the very same comet that's arriving that's arriving this year? Astronomers care about that because they have if the answer is yes, they have data about when the comet appeared earlier. That's a question about whether there's a particular object such that information about it was somehow in intellectual commerce and got recorded in some Chinese inscription. It's not a question about the meaning of the word comet in Chinese theorizing. And in fact, very, very often when we recognize earlier diagnoses, when we recognize that a particular published diagnosis of a disease in some other culture in some other time probably was a report of the very same disease we're asking, were they causally sensitive in a reliable way to a particular kind of infection, not what their concepts were like. And it seems to me that that's the notion of reference you want for the philosophy of science, because you want to be able to say, at least sometimes, we track the same phenomenon using the same terms, even though concepts change. Now, I actually am committed in these slides to something that you may not like, but it's concept involving. I think sometimes the conceptual meaning of a term, that is what you have to have in your head in order to sort of participate in discourse, is profoundly misleading. I think you cannot read the literature in evolutionary psych unless you take on board somehow or other a whole series of inferences that link evolutionary scenarios to hypotheses about innateness. Now, since those inferences are defective, the way you should take them on board as a philosopher from the outside, but the way you learn to take them on board when you go to grad school to do this stuff is that they're automatic. So I think that we can have a notion of conceptual understanding that's only distantly related to getting it right. I think there'll be sub-communities in which conceptual resources are distinctly associated with words and with understanding and with communication, but not in ways that facilitate growth of knowledge. And in other cases, we're lucky. And the conceptual resources we have actually help to move us forward.
Okay, so you're next.
Yes, thank you very much for this. I was wondering the following. That I understand you as saying basically that in order to defend kind of a reasonable version of scientific realism,
I'm adding reference. I'm adding correspondence, not deleting. But in order to defend the correct version, yes, go ahead.
I didn't say anything about correspondence, so I don't do...
No, I thought you said weakened.
No.
I misunderstood.
No,
okay.
Let me speak louder and start from the beginning. So my point is, in order to defend a reasonable version of scientific realism, you do that by abandoning traditional views on the semantic side,
Which ones?
In the sense that it seems to be that you're saying that we should believe that theories kind of tracks reality, but we shouldn't think of them as kind of literally one-to-one. We shouldn't be committed to kind of the prima facie ontology of the claims. So would it be fair to say that your way of describing this kind of realism is in some sense a way of going away from the claim that we should understand the scientific theories literally? Because often scientific realists have this claim that we should understand scientific theories literally as an important part of their kind of account.
Well, actually, I don't think I'm actually committed to that. That is, I want to say that, well, if I'm countenancing the possibility that terms partially denote. Okay, so the rule, take theories literally. If it isn't part of your semantic tradition to think that sometimes there could be unnoticed ambiguity, then you couldn't say take it literally. But I take it that our ordinary practice in thinking about language is to recognize that sometimes there's ambiguity that we haven't diagnosed. But I do think that what's required in order to make sense of the way in which scientific theories correspond to the world is to reflect on the fact that sometimes terminology links our practice to features of the world in messy ways. Now, see, I don't know, maybe that violates traditional science. See, I think it might, look, I'm not sure what scientific realism is, but let me give you a picture first. Do we know about any little things? Empiricists, no. Scientific realists, yes. Do we make the world by establishing graduate programs? Kuhn, yes. Scientific realists, no. When we think we know true things about the world, is that only a matter of speaking because Tarski has shown that that the truth predicate can be erased? No. I don't think that either scientific realists or, for that matter, empiricists either are committed to all of our linguistic efforts being really clean. And so I think that it should be part of the idea that scientific theories succeed when, to some extent, they correspond with the world. I think that view ought to go with a view of how language actually works in practice, which allows for things being messy. But if there are versions of scientific realism that are incompatible with that, then I think they're not the version to have. But I think the traditional debates were the ones I mentioned. Look, species is an interesting case because Darwin wrote a book on the origin of them where he said they don't exist. He said there's no distinction between species of all varieties. Other people have picked up the idea that, well, maybe Ernst Mayr has shown for sexually reproducing organisms how to define it. Then other people said, wow, they're actually individuals. It seems to me that the broadly scientific picture that Darwin was getting is something real about how forms of life change over time, should survive any plausible view of how messy the term species was in its history, provided the idea that the use of that term got at some real phenomena and not others, sort of local stabilities. So, but I agree with you that what Putnam attributed to me when he launched this thing, namely that terms in scientific theories usually refer, I think he meant usually refer uniquely, and that the laws are typically approximately true. I think the former is stronger than it should be. I think on any plausible account of approximation, the latter is probably right often, because I want to say that you could have a book about the origin of species in which you maintain that there aren't any, and it could nevertheless be that this is the book about speciation.
Carl.
Yes. So I got a little bit struck early on in the talk with a dialectical point that bothered me, which was you asserted that practice-specific argument works pretty well in kind of a local context. But couldn't fundamental premise involved in that is we have all these auxiliary theories which are basically approximately true. And I couldn't see why an anti-realist would be willing to concede that.
Oh, I remember. Well, I can get that one for you. I'm interested. Look, I'm happy to defend it in some other setting. This argument for realism, the FFP argument for realism. But I meant to respond here to an interesting move. See, I think the situation is that now the early discovery of the transuranium elements typically involved measurements from single atoms. Someone who says, yeah, but actually we don't know about unobservable things like atoms, I think is so far outside good science that you better follow some argument for scientific realism, but I'm not defending that view here. What I'm struck by is a real ingenuity of Loudon in saying, well, maybe, Loudon doesn't say we don't know about anything unobservable, but he says a certain picture of how truth plays a role in science just doesn't fit the history. That the realist can't say that current science is methodologically successful because earlier scientific theories were near the truth, because she'll surely want to say that current theories are near the truth, that's the key idea, and by those lights, the earlier theories were not near the truth. So I was interested in that argument, but I agree with you that someone like Arthur Klein or Rotman or I mean, there are other people too, might just reject the initial argument. Sure.
Well, actually, my worry was prompted by something that came later in the slides, but I want to put that aside,
Okay.
because what I'm concerned about is really more connected with the referential discussion
Okay.
we've just been having. And my worry is that essentially you're making reference so wobbly and loose and relaxed that essentially what it's going to come down to is that for species to refer is for there to be something in the world that eventually will explain why our use of the word species helped us get things approximately empirically
Yeah,
correct.
that's exactly what I want to propose that.
We would never deny that.
Oh, no, whoa. Von Frosten, I don't know what he thinks about species, okay, so I'm not arguing against these people. I'm trying to say this. I think that the use of scientific language is systematically connected in the world in a way that allows us to achieve a growth of knowledge, maybe only about observables, but let's pretend we're not worried about that issue. I think the picture that theoretical terms in science have unique referents is a picture that's rarely true. I think that a situation in a science in which there's a unique referent for a term is often a real theoretical achievement. So it seems to me on any account of how scientific language works prior to these real achievements, we need some way in which to talk about scientific terms being systematically connected to certain kinds of phenomena in the world and not others. I think partial denotation is the key example. I think that's what you need for a theory of reference. I think you want to know you want to ask how does language correspond to the world in a scientific case in such a way that there can be a growth of knowledge. I think you need an account of reference according to which a term participates in reference if it's aligned with stuff in a way that eventually provides insight. Often, that will involve partial denotation. I think in the case of things like oxidation state, it's even messier, but that's, I'm happy to throw that away. But actually, I think sentences rarely have determinate truth value, because I think that in the sciences, because I think there are enough indeterminate terms. And I think our propositional attitudes in the sciences rarely have determinate content, because we're trafficking in concepts whose connection to the world is insufficiently refined. So that's actually one. I like the view that you attributed to me. I think it's actually true, and I think one of the ways in which the mathematization of empiricism that arose when people incorporated sophisticated mathematical logic, I think one of the ways in which that happened made it harder to see how messy the alignment of language in the world is, even in everyday cases. I mean, even in cases with so I do subscribe to approximately the view you attributed to me, and I think that that's simply a correct view of language on scientific grounds. I mean, I think if you looked at cases that aren't esoteric, the classification of diseases, for example. Medical practice converges on very precise understandings of particular diseases only by incremental stages. But in the early stages, it's not as though pneumonia and lung cancer were grouped together with injuries to the feet. So I think that an account of how language actually works is going to involve some kind of cleaning up.
Keith, you're next.
Yeah, it's just a very quick question. So maybe this is not a problem given your wobbly notion of reference. But so here, one of the classical cases that often is discussed is the field concept in classical electrodynamics. So one wobbly reference idea is people talk about the ether as opposed to refer to the field. But there's also a tradition in 20th century physics where people say, well, we should do away with the field concept. We stick with the same equations, but we treat the field as a fictitious entity. And there's a legitimate scientific reason for trying to go that way. But so here we have maybe two theories that are observationally indistinguishable. One has fields, the other has no fields. Is that a problem for your realism? I mean, there's people here.
I actually don't, I don't think the people who say do away with fields, I think that's going to turn out to, I think the reasons for that are going to turn out to be instrumentalisms. I don't think it will work. But if it did, then I would think that here's a situation in which the language of physicists is very clearly onto something. There are ways in which charged particles at a distance respond somehow to each other, and there's a question about energy conservation, which is addressed when they move and when there's radiation, electromagnetic radiation. There's a question of where the energy goes. Everybody knows that there are those questions. There are different ideas that are in play to handle that question, including some that don't countenance fields. I would take it, if that's the actual situation, that would be a situation in which the language of physics is pretty well accommodated to describing the phenomenology, and in which there's an outstanding research question of how you clean it up. So I guess I don't actually think that there's an appropriate choice there. I think you better have fields or something like that. But I'm not going to defend that. If there really is a legitimate choice, then the structure of the language of physics would be such that it was aligned with lots of interesting features of the physical world, but there was an open question which kind of alignment was most perspicuous. But it happens all the time.
Once again, I've got more questions in the queue than we've got time for, so I'm afraid to say that the next question is going to have to be the last one. My apologies to those who were waiting, but Undone, if you get the last question.
Oh, actually, I think versions of my question have been asked, so why don't you go to that?
Okay, then, Elliot.
I wanted to ask you about something in the beginning of the talk where you were contrasting what Putnam may have said and with what you meant. And as I understood it, the difference was that the wrong version of the argument is about a specific theory. It's been predictably accurate, therefore it's probably true. You say, no, that's the wrong picture. Rather, take a bunch of theories that are all motivated by the same background picture, background theory. When those are successful, that's serious evidence for this background thing they have in common being true or approximately true. So there's this shift from the particular theories and an argument about whether you should be realist about them to some background theory that a bunch of theories.
Well,
am I describing what you said correctly?
Yeah, well, approximately. Only because I think the background theoretical conception needn't be a unitary theory. Imagine you're a synthetic chemist and you want to know how to make some compound. And you read through the literature and you look at all sorts of reaction mechanisms that people have published, and you think, maybe if I combine this one with that one and do it at this temperature, when I do an NMR, I'll get this spectrum as the observational result. There are infinitely many experiments you might try and get this. I want to say that your work in the literature greatly enhances the likelihood that you'll come up with a synthetic technique that gets the right observational prediction, and that's not an accident. That's because your earlier chemists really know a lot about reaction mechanisms, and you're looking for commonalities. So it needn't be the atomic theory of matter. It can be quite particular.
My question is, I don't see that it makes a difference to the, so to speak, conformational significance of these successes, whether you look at one theory or at a background thing, unitary or not, that's doing a good job. The epistemological thing in both cases for me is that to assess whether the theory has been confirmed or it's probably true, you have to consider alternatives to it.
Right.
And the description as given, where you just have the theory is successful or the background theory is successful, that's an incomplete thing. You can't get there from here. So I don't see why the shift changes the epistemological problem.
It changes because if you suppose you're extrapolating from a finite body of data, and you're an empiricist, you're going to get a generalization about the observable world. You're not going to have tested that generalization rigorously unless you try to refute it. But there are indefinitely many experiments which could conceivably undermine it. a responsible scientist is going to try and figure out where it's vulnerable to refutation and try and run, that's what a good referee's report will insist on. How do you decide where it's most vulnerable to refutation? Well, in practice, you make use of what you think you know about the underlying mechanisms to find out which scientifically plausible configuration of underlying mechanisms might produce a result different from the generalization you are proposing. And you test that generalization against generalizations underwritten by other scientifically plausible mechanistic accounts. And what I'm going to say is that is how people make these judgments. And it seems to me that you can't explain why that's a good way of testing theories unless you assume that people already knew stuff. Remember, this is the empiricist debate, okay? Empiricists agree that people already know a lot of stuff before they do the next experiment, but they say the stuff they know about is all observable. And the scientific realist says, actually, they're actually making use of a whole lot of knowledge about little stuff, too, when they design the correct experiment.
Let's thank our speaker.